Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the museum's president, and it is my great honor to be in conversation this evening with Dr. Lara Vapnek. She's a professor of American history at St. John's University here in New York City. She specializes in labor history and gender history. She is the author of wonderful books, Breadwinners, and also a biography of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And she has a new book she's working on, which is on the history of infant feeding that goes from the 19th century all the way through the 1950s.
Or even further, maybe.
Yes, so it might develop. And then also, just this month, an article in the Journal of American History was published, a wonderful article on the history of wet nurses here in New York City. So hopefully we're going to get to that topic as well. So welcome and thank you all for joining us. This program, we're going to delve into history, but I have to say that this program and the idea of kind of putting this together this evening was inspired by recent events in our lives, which is the recent Supreme Court case. And I want to start with that. And we're going to start with that, and hopefully at the end of the discussion we'll go back to that. But I just wanted to, as a historian, as you saw this court decision come through, and of course it was leaked in advance, so we had time to kind of absorb it a little bit. But still
shocking, I think. Even though we knew it was coming, I think when it came, it was really surprising. And just as a historian of women and gender, just thought, wow, what does this mean for women in the present, the future, and also how we understand the past. So present, the future, and also how we understand the past. So
it's like living through a historical moment.
Exactly.
And what were your thoughts with regard to kind of what does history have to say about this particular ruling? Like, what is it about kind of like your knowledge of history that you think adds an interesting perspective on what has just happened?
Right. So I think sort of in the largest sense, I would place this ruling within a really long historical struggle over who's going to control women's bodies and who's going to control women's reproductive rights. And that has been a question for a long time, and this is now changing the calculus in a sense. So it definitely falls in that way within like a long historical tradition of struggle, I think, on both sides. And then also the thing that I really take away, and I think that's so relevant to the Tenement Museum, is that whether or not birth control and abortion are legal, people are still going to practice them. And so the question is really not, is this going to be legal or is this going to be illegal? Although that's certainly very significant, but it's really, are these methods going to be safe? Are they going to be effective? And are they going to be accessible? And unfortunately, when these things become illegal, the question is often no, and especially for poor women, working class women, women of color.
So historically, when we look at this building, and this building opens up in 1863 and it closes to residents in 1935, tell us a little bit about how accessible birth control was to women who might have lived in this building. And the women who lived in this building were often of East European, Jewish, German, Irish, Italian backgrounds. And most of them already had families while they were living here. And so I'm just curious from like their perspective, what was happening? And also, I guess, even to rewind a little bit and talk about in US history in general in the 19th century, was abortion legal? What was the understanding of that, and how did that change? So even before the immigrants arrived and moved here.
Right. So first of all, to start with the women who were here, interestingly, in 1863, there wouldn't have really been any laws against birth control, although abortion was becoming illegal in many states, and I'll return to that in a second. And in effect, it was actually the proliferation of kind of a commercial culture surrounding birth control in the 1870s that led Anthony Comstock in 1873 to successfully persuade Congress to make birth control devices and information about birth control, to label it as obscene, to prevent it being sent, any of it being sent through the federal mail or crossing state lines. And the Comstock decision stands until 1938. So for the majority of time that we're talking about in the Tenement Museum, actually birth control was illegal. But we know, in part from just looking at the demographics and the size of the families, that people definitely were practicing birth control. And although we don't have sources telling us exactly what they were doing, we can surmise, from looking at advertisements, police records, social investigations, we can kind of figure out what women were doing. But as to the question of abortion, that's a really interesting one. And I just want to say, abortion and birth control, they're not exactly the same thing. And in general, abortion is, when birth control fails, that tends to be when women resort to abortion. So up through the colonial era, during the colonial era, and even up through the mid-19th century, American law followed common law, and the idea in the principle in common law was basically that it was not an abortion until a woman had experienced quickening, and that would be the fetal movement. And up until that point, it was not really considered a life, and the fetus was, considered to be inert. We have to also think fetal imaging has changed the way that we understand all of this. But in the 19th century, it was really based on the women's own account of whether or not movement had occurred. And oftentimes, women would maybe in retrospect we would say they were conducting abortions. That wasn't really how they saw it at the time. They
it was
might
like
have
a
thought,
return of the menses.
right? Like the menses was suppressed, and it needed to be, brought back into kind of a regular rhythm. So there were ways of doing that using mostly herbal remedies, I would say, up through the mid-19th century. In the late 19th century, there started to be more surgical ways of doing it, but it wasn't really considered a crime. And to the degree it was prosecuted at all, it was more the people who were performing it than the women who were getting it. And then I know we have a lot to talk about, so I don't want to get stuck on this. But another thing that I think is really interesting about the early history of abortion is that the first struggle to outlaw it, some of the early reasoning surrounding that was an argument that married white middle-class women were resorting to abortion to limit the number of children that they had. And so this raised all kinds of alarm, and this was used to argue that the wrong kind of people were reproducing. And so abortion needed to be made illegal so that white women did not have access to it. And when I say white women, I should also specify not Irish women, right? Because there was a big influx of Irish population in the mid-19th century, or later on, not Italian women or Jewish women. So I think it just kind of clues us into an important theme in this history, which is that the history of birth control and abortion and reproductive rights is it's almost always racialized, but in different ways, in different times and places.
Right, in the way that class, gender, and race are kind of inextricably connected in this analysis. And so thinking about this space that we're in right now, this is not a bedroom, although you can see a bedroom, I think, behind us if the cameras pick that up. Caroline and John Schneider, who ran this saloon, they opened it in 1864 and ran it until 1885. And so this would be a place that would be almost like a living room for the community, as people from the different apartments in this building, as well as the neighborhood, came to socialize. They came to do business. They came to exchange information. And we know that in the Stadtzeitung, which was the German newspaper, that we know that John Schneider used because he and Caroline Schneider placed their ad in this. There was another ad for a midwife named, I think it's Dr. H.T. Grobel. She was at 100 Orchard Street, just across the street, and the ad says, "Unerring midwifery also cures for all bad secret illnesses." So what do you think this might mean? All cures for bad, we don't know for sure, but is this an indication that as a midwife, she might also be providing some form of birth control to the women who
I think it's very likely that she was providing birth control and maybe even abortion services. And I also think the language is really interesting of all bad secret problems.
Well, secret. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing here. It's so secret, right? And that's the whole reason that we don't have any sources about it, because things that are private, by definition, people aren't going to be like telling their grandchildren about it, and that passes into the oral history. Like, it doesn't work like that. But that's why these newspapers become so important in these ads and like the code words that are not so coded.
Right.
And so we also know that in the saloon, there was a man named Heinrich Dreyer and his wife Friederike Dreyer. And Heinrich Dreyer was a real estate agent. We know he was here because he advertised in this newspaper, and he said, come if you want to learn about real estate, come to my office at 97 Orchard, John Schneider Saloon. So he basically had his table set up. It was like his Starbucks or whatever, and people could come and talk to him. But what we found is in 1865, he initiated a libel suit against another German couple because they had accused, apparently, his wife of being an abortionist back in Germany. So like this idea of this is in the air, right? It's not how you want to be associated necessarily, but it's in the air. And so likewise, we can imagine that this might be a place where people are maybe having conversations, maybe not on a Sunday when it's so public, but maybe women are meeting with Caroline Schneider and they're talking about how they might be using birth control. And Caroline Schneider herself, I mean, I think they're married for a good 15 years before she becomes pregnant. She's 42 years old when she's pregnant for the first time. So, well, let me backtrack. She has a child when she's 42 years old. We don't know for sure whether this is an adopted child, where it's natural. We don't know that, but it's possible that she had been practicing birth control up until that point. So again, these are ways in which we don't know exactly, we don't know the conversations, but by looking at the newspapers, by looking at the trajectories of people's lives, we can make some assumptions about what might have been happening. Tell us a little bit about the methods people might have used for birth control. And I think we have some images here as well that we can cue up.
Yeah, so I think the slides are a great way to start. And the first methods wouldn't actually be on the slides, but that would be what we might think of as natural methods: abstinence, withdrawal, prolonged lactation, which we know didn't work very well because breastfeeding women were advised to stop breastfeeding once they became pregnant, and that kind of clues us in. That was not very effective. And then also the rhythm method, which would be keeping track of a woman keeping track of her cycle. Unfortunately, the advice for the rhythm method was a little bit off base, in that women were advised that if they did not want to get pregnant, it was safe to have sex a week to 10 days after their last menstrual period, which is kind of reversed. So yeah, that didn't work very well. And then there were just this huge range of devices that were used. And that was part of what kind of got Comstock's ire, I think, was that in the 1870s, you could go into any pharmacy and see all of these devices. And that's part of what outraged him.
What was it about, do we know more about Anthony Comstock and why this issue?
I mean, I would say this is probably something where, it's a social moment, and in a sense, he's standing in for maybe sort of an old-fashioned, upright white man who thinks that, morals have gone out the window, and, we need to kind of crack down on vice.
But clearly he wasn't alone.
No.
Because all of this,
if this was an unpopular idea, then it wouldn't have sailed through Congress. So this was an idea. And then I think, I just have to point out, as a historian of women and gender, I really think a lot of the anxiety is that women might have sex for purposes other than procreation. Totally acceptable for men to do that, sort of expected and acceptable.
Well, and to that point, wasn't the first the condoms during World War I were
that was the first legal method of birth control, although it wasn't considered to be, wasn't sort of marketed for birth control. But anyways, I'm getting away.
Sorry,
I'm getting away from my devices. The devices.
Go ahead,
the devices on the slides. So in 1839, vulcanized rubber was invented, and that was the beginning of more flexible materials that could be used, and that really revolutionized the devices that were available. So condoms, which had previously been made from animal membranes, started to be made from rubber. And then also there was the development of all kinds of other things, douching, syringes, diaphragms, cervical caps, IUDs, and we see some of these on the slides. And I think you can get a sense of, just kind of the range of things that were available, how they were packaged. But for most of the time, of this, of the people living in the Tenement Museum, these were not medical devices yet, right? So they were things from the 1870s through the 1930s that were really being sold. Maybe a peddler was coming by, or they were being sold at the corner store, or you could order by mail. There were a lot of euphemisms that were being used to describe what their purposes were. And then, like you say, I think women were probably talking about it all the time. There were probably a lot of conversations about birth control that were happening among women, conversations that were happening with midwives. And again, I think there's also a class difference here, in that if you look at the papers of middle-class women or elite women, you can find letters often that they wrote to relatives talking about maybe struggles they were having in terms of too frequent pregnancies, miscarriages, maybe wanting to get pregnant and having trouble with it. So you've got at least those letters that tell you how they were thinking about it. And I think one of the challenges with the people that lived here is we're not as likely to have letters. We have more fragmentary kind of secondhand information, and that reflects the social class of the people that lived here, which is not to say that they didn't write letters, but they weren't kept because they weren't considered to be significant.
If someone has an archive of letters written by people in tenements, please let us know. We would, for lots of reasons, we would love to have access to that. And there's a difference with regard to class also with what types of birth control are being used, right? As we get into the 20th century and Margaret Sanger is advocating the use of diaphragm and jelly, right? But that's more expensive than it would be, and you have to go to a doctor and be fitted for that too.
Right.
So there still is an appeal to like a kind of ad in a newspaper talking about like a douche that you just go buy at the pharmacy, and that's private and you're not having any interaction with anyone, and it's much cheaper. So I think like that class thing runs across all of this in terms of what are people using and what's effective. But then again, that point that you made earlier I think is so important too, that this was not regulated and there wasn't that much motivation to improve.
Right.
And no one was testing the efficacy.
Anyone could sell for birth control, they would. And one of the most popular products was Lysol, which we know as a home disinfectant, but it was marketed really heavily effectively for birth control. It wasn't advertised as birth control. It was sort of, douching that would remove all germs.
I think I have. Yeah, I have
and women.
But then women who got in trouble couldn't sue for that because they never said that
the company had no liability because that's not what it was really marketed for. But that was a major use of Lysol, and actually there were studies that were done maybe in the late 30s, early 40s that just showed the number. It was maybe 500 women who had used a Lysol douche, and I think about half had gotten pregnant. And then there were others actually who had died. They, got infections, they were poisoned, obviously very unsafe practice. So there's a way in which, just the unregulated nature of it and the dangers, I think, again, tended to fall on working class women who couldn't get the medical care that middle class women had available to them, which is not to say that it was totally easy for the middle class women either. I think there was still a lot of stigma surrounding birth control, but it was something that if they wanted it, it was more accessible.
And going back to women who would have lived in the tenements, I think that, and not necessarily this tenement, but tenements more broadly, your article about wet nurses, I think, is so helpful in driving home the point that women who needed to work to support their families had very few choices with regard to what kind of work they could do. And we know that this happens to the women who live in this building, right? Women are deserted by husbands, they're widowed, and they have children. How are you going to support these children? And so, this idea, you could sew, you could work as a dressmaker, you could watch other women's children, you could wash laundry for other women. But then this idea too that you could become a wet nurse, and you explore this, and it really magnifies or sets into relief the class differences, right? So that a woman is going to move into a home of an upper class woman and nurse their family, nurse their babies, and she leaves her baby with someone else who gets a bottle or who isn't able to, and often, and the scandal that happens when some of these babies die or get sick. So tell us a little bit about your article and what you found, and how it relates to the tenements.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think wet nursing is maybe one of the starkest examples of just the desperation that poor mothers faced in the 19th century if they didn't have male support. And essentially women's labor, if they were not educated professionals, and that was a very, very small group, was really commodifying domestic work that they did for their families. So it was commodifying the kind of unpaid labor that they normally perform for their families. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, in some cases sex work, and wet nursing. I mean, honestly, I kind of just came upon it, and it was hard for me to believe that this was going on in late 19th century New York City, but indeed it was. And a lot of women, the way that I found, and this again, I had such trouble finding sources, right? I have no letters from wet nurses. But what I did discover was that there was an organization called the Nursery and Child's Hospital that was actually founded by elite women in the 1850s trying to help the children of wet nurses. So basically saying all of these infants are dying, this is terrible, we need to do something, we need to start a new charitable organization to take them in. But at the same time, these elite women were often relying on wet nurses themselves, and so they ended up running essentially an employment agency.
And they were perpetuating.
Right, and so they became part of the very thing that they hoped to change. But another aspect of that story that relates to our discussion tonight is one thing that I discovered when I was going back through the papers and reading the annual reports of the physicians that worked in the hospital, was that most of the women, they said that the vast majority of women who were there working as wet nurses had actually tried to end their pregnancies because they knew they could not afford.
And most of them had children. They already had children.
And many of them had other children. And the image, one of the images that I have, which is of Eliza Crawford. I don't know if you can look at that. If you
so
can
that's
pull up
of
that
the
slide. But and the picture is labeled Louise Tiffany and her wet nurse. And I was able to figure out the identity of the wet nurse, which was one of my big archival discoveries, because she's not named anywhere. And I think just the fact that the photo is captioned Louise Tiffany and her wet nurse, that just suggests the ways that the reproductive labor of immigrant, in this case an Irish woman, was basically used to support, the formation of an elite family.
And tell us again too why Mrs. Tiffany, for example, would not have wanted to nurse her own babies.
That's a great question. So basically at this point in the 1850s, there's this ideology of domesticity and female delicacy. It's a very race-specific, class-specific idea, and it was a very popular idea at the time that breastfeeding, it was kind of difficult physical labor, it was difficult, it was messy, it was just too hard for these delicate white women to undertake on their own, and so they needed to hire a servant to do it. Ideally an Irish immigrant. Also black women also worked as wet nurses, although interestingly they were excluded from the charity that was offered by the Nursery and Child's Hospital. So there were points where wet nursing actually crossed lines of race in some ways, certainly in the labor market, but not in terms of any sort of provision of social welfare.
And the women who moved in weren't able to visit their own children.
Right. So the reason that I surmise that this woman was named Eliza Crawford is there was this scandal that the Nursery and Child's Hospital was trying to squash when Eliza Crawford went back. She had boarded 2 of her children. She had 3 children, and she was recently widowed, and she had boarded 2 of the children at the Nursery and Child's Hospital, which essentially ran, it was similar to an orphanage probably, except mothers could visit, but she went and demanded the release of her children. And this was probably, there might have been an epidemic going around, she might have heard a rumor that there was mistreatment, so she went.
Or she missed her children.
Right, she went and tried to get them back, and the matron would not give them back. They had very strict rules. Mothers were only allowed to visit once every 2 weeks. And so she went at an unassigned time to try to get her children back, and she ended up in a physical altercation with the matron, and actually it says in the minutes of the Nursery and Child's Hospital that she struck the matron in the breast, which I thought, again, the choice of language, like, wow, this is a woman who, yeah, she's trying to get her children back. And unfortunately, I don't, it's like I have this little bit of information and I don't know if she succeeded, but I do know from the letters that Harriet Tiffany, who was the mother of Louise Tiffany, the baby she was paid to nurse, actually was supportive of her and was concerned, and so the directors of the Nursery and Child's Hospital were very worried that this was going to get around and make them look bad. And they actually wrote one of, kind of the most amazing things I found. They wrote a letter to Mr. Tiffany and said, you need to rein in your wife, Harriet, who should know better than to take the word of a lowly servant against, respectable women like us. And she actually threatened, and she said, if any of these rumors start going around that there's anything wrong at the Nursery and Child's Hospital, we will have the wet nurse arrested. Wow. Knowing how dangerous it might be to take a wet nurse away from an infant at a moment, So that was like, wow.
I'm sure like reading that letter that just jumped off the page.
Yeah, it was
because
just like,
it's such a stark articulation of power.
Yeah. And, the power that the managers had to manage the labor of the wet nurses, but also the wet nurses themselves. I don't want to say they formed a labor union, that would be going way too far, but 30 or 40 of them would be working together in the Nursery and Child's Hospital, also taking care of the babies there. And it seems that they cooperated informally to try to improve their working conditions. And one of the big questions was how many infants they would feed. They were always assigned to feed their own baby and then an additional infant. And the women really resisted that. They really just wanted to feed their own infants and not have a second child to feed.
Well, and I think, too, one of the things that's important to note as context is that in the 19th century and early 20th century, a child could be an orphan even if a child had living parents, if the family couldn't afford to take care of them. So
absolutely,
that thinking about because so many of the institutions that are forming in the late 19th and early 20th century in response to immigration and urbanization and the growth of the tenements deal with orphans, but it's just, I think that's something that people are often surprised to hear. And often it's not that the parent abandons the child,
right? It's
more that the parent, due to economic stress and circumstances, isn't able to
absolutely. And for widowed mothers, in my first book, I talk about a woman named Lenora O'Reilly who grew up in the tenements and was a labor activist. She had to go out to work in, I think it was a collar factory when she was 11 years old. And basically her mother sent her out to work because she didn't want to have to put her in an orphanage. So a lot of child labor was just a kind of desperate attempt
to keep the family
together. And that was the only way to do it.
So I think another way that women were able to earn money, although it wasn't, it certainly wasn't as much as people working in the garment industry, is being a midwife. And we know from records here that there were midwives who delivered the babies. So in particular, we have the birth certificate of Max Levine that you can see on the slide. And you can see on the slide the bedroom and the midwife's tools that we have set up in the living bedroom, the room in which Kat Lloyd was in earlier in the introduction, and then the birth certificate that also lists the birth of Max Levine in 1897 and notes that he was delivered by Esther Kolmanovsky, a midwife who lived at 38 Norfolk Street, just around the corner. So midwives played such an important role. Not only was it a way for immigrant women to make a living, and also Black women who were coming from the South, serving their communities, it was also just a source of comfort, I think, for many of these women to be able to turn to someone of their own background to take care of them. And that the midwives were less expensive than doctors coming and were viewed as safer than doctors. And also the midwives would take care of the women in the homes. They would clean, and they would come back and they would visit the mothers as they were kind of coming out of childbirth. So I think it was midwives cost $5 and a doctor coming is $10. But at the same time, like right at this moment, at the turn of the 20th century, you have the field of obstetrics wanting to professionalize and doctors wanting to get in on this business because they have this. So you start to have this like competition in some ways between the midwives and the doctors. And I think right around the corner on Broome Street, there's a lying-in hospital, and they understood that women would not want to go to hospitals because hospitals was viewed as going, you know, as a place to die. But the idea is that maybe we can get in if we send the doctors to the women. So this lying-in hospital that was just around the corner sent doctors to deliver childbirths. And what you see over the first few decades of the 20th century is that the percentage of babies delivered through midwives decreases significantly as doctors are making their claim. And one of the sources we have in thinking about midwives is that of social workers who went out to kind of investigate who these midwives were and what was happening. But curious your thoughts on midwives and the role that they played in the tenements.
Yeah, and I think just being here and thinking about a baby being delivered in one of these, you know, tiny rooms with limited
90 square feet, I think. Yeah.
Right, a very small room there was water. I'm thinking, where was the
water? I mean, up until 1905, you're bringing water up the stairs from the rear yard.
Right. So that was also, I mean, pretty arduous work to deliver a baby.
And it wasn't as if the rest of the tenement residents left, right? You know, so you also have the background noise of in 1900, 111 people living in the building.
Right. And I think, I mean, part of what it speaks to is that childbirth in the 19th century was much more of a social sort of communal event. So it would be very typical for women to have female relatives come in, their neighbors might come in, close friends, and the midwife. And so I think the fact that the midwife reflected the women's ethnicity and religion and race, that made her a very, you know, a more kind of comforting presence. So, you know, what you see in the progressive era, I think, is that you see midwives get blamed for a lot of the problems.
And that's why the sources, we have to read those sources very carefully.
Those sources are definitely biased against midwives. And so ignorant midwives get blamed. In New York City, but also in the American South, where it was mostly black women who were practicing as midwives, they're often getting blamed for high rates of maternal mortality and infant mortality. And there was, I mean, at the same time, there was an issue in that new medical technologies that were becoming available theoretically might make childbirth safer. They didn't immediately, I wouldn't say. And up until the 1930s, actually, midwives probably had, you know, higher success rates than obstetricians in hospitals. But women also had a lot of fear of childbirth. I mean, there was no pain relief. There was no medical equipment if anything went awry. So I think, you know, it's interesting looking at the historical record, but also the way that historians have analyzed it. I think initially, maybe women's historians, you know, kind of focused on the midwife and the woman having control over her childbirth, which for sure she did have a lot more control in her own home than she did in the hospital. On the other hand, there were some real, you know, dangers, and women really looked on childbirth with trepidation. And so when an option that seemed to be safer became available, a lot of women were happy to take it. And that would go for black women as well as white women. It's interesting because midwives were so prevalent in the American South, but black people who migrated to New York City in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were actually more likely to go to a hospital to have their baby than immigrant women who kind of continued to be attached to their midwives. So I think it's interesting how different groups of women, you know, the choices that they make. and even the choices they can make. I mean, of course, because eventually when childbirth gets moved to the hospital, there's no choice, right? If you're going to have your baby, you have to go to the hospital once midwives pretty much cease to practice in a meaningful way, which I would say would be by the 30s, probably.
That's what I think. By 1930, only 5% of births in New York are from midwives. So that seems right. I mean, in the same decades, though, you're also seeing the size of families decrease because of all of this urbanization. So whether someone's coming from the American South, or they're coming from Italy, there's this movement into cities, and when you move into cities, having extra mouths to feed is different than having people to help work on a farm, right? So that there is all of this change happening.
And just being in the physical space here, right? And
you
seeing
understand
the apartments.
why.
Imagine trying to put 11 children, into a tenement apartment.
Yeah, and we see even in this tenement. So like in 1900, the average number of children was like 3.7, and then 1910 it goes to like 3.2, and then it goes to 3, and then by 1930 it's 2. And that's, keep in mind too, that's like the children who happen to be at home when the census taker is here, and the women could have had more children, but overall you're seeing this decline that tracks with the desire to limit the number of people in the families. Midwives, though, also get, as you were saying, they get this kind of bad association, and one of them is being an abortionist, and we saw that earlier with the German community, but we certainly see that again. And there's like a charity magazine in 1906 had a nurse, Elizabeth Crowell, go out and survey, and she interviewed 500 midwives, and she inspected their bags. And from this and from these interviews, she surmised that 175 of the 500 were also abortionists. So again, we don't know if her methods were thoroughly sound, but we know that again, there's this association and this need for when birth control fails for abortion. And at the same time, you also start to have women, part of the progressive movement and reformers, coming to the Lower East Side and seeing, whether it's Lillian Wald as a visiting nurse, or later Margaret Sanger, who starts her career as a reformer, as a visiting nurse, seeing the effects of families with limited income, with families that aren't able to kind of take care of the children that they have, and the need that women have, and the desire that they have for some way to control their lives. And she tells this story, right, and again, we don't know if it's a story that was made up after the fact, but the very fact that she told the story over and over again and it resonated gave a certain kind of, it was believable, right, that there was a woman, Sadie Sachs, over on the Lower East Side, who had had a botched abortion. And she had earlier said to the doctor, Margaret Sanger had overheard her ask the doctor, how can I not have so many children? And his response was, tell Jake was the husband, to sleep on the roof. And that was something that motivated Margaret Sanger to do better, to kind of understand what could be done for these women in the tenements. And so she coins the term birth control as part of this movement.
Right. And I think one of her big focuses was also to put birth control in women's hands, right? She didn't trust Jake to go up and sleep on the roof, and she thought that women needed to have access to this themselves, because ultimately they were the ones that were going to, literally bear the consequences of pregnancy.
And so part of that too is sharing information, and so Comstock law is still in effect. So we see this clash, right? Because she writes a book or a pamphlet, what every girl should know, that gets translated into Yiddish and I imagine Italian.
Yeah, and I just think that's another effect of the Comstock law, was just to make any sort of discussion of sex obscene, and that was something that Sanger was countering, was just to give women some basic information, and which is not to say that they didn't discuss things, but Sanger was a nurse, and she had any information that she gave out, was medically correct at the time. So it was actually just to put the information in women's hands and to help them understand their bodies. That was a big part of her early, I think, probably her lifelong mission. But
and we can see the image of a clinic, the first clinic that she opens up in Brownsville. And I think what's so interesting there too is that you see how it's translated into Yiddish as well as Italian. And then that photo too is there's I think we have it. And I know, Lara, you had mentioned that one of the things that strikes you is the women with the baby carriages outside the clinic. Like these are women already with families.
Right. These are women who already have, a lot of them already have children, and they're deciding they can't afford to have any more, maybe at this moment, maybe not never, but not now. So they're seeking to limit their children based on their economic circumstances.
And Margaret Sanger, of course, is jailed for this. So this is, part of this movement that's so important and so foundational in understanding the birth control movement, and the organizations that she would create would evolve into Planned Parenthood. But it's important, I think, too, to kind of discuss her association with eugenics. And then I'm wondering kind of if you could explain that a little bit. First of all, like, what is eugenics? And how did she become associated with it, and how has that kind of tarnished her reputation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something that is, a very important part of her legacy, and also just an important part of the history of birth control, I think, is always to be thinking, who actually is in control here? Are these technologies that women are in control of, or is the state in control of them? In which case they can be used in really negative ways. But Sanger really began, she began as kind of a Greenwich Village radical.
Right, she would hang out with Emma Goldman and Rose Pastor Stokes.
And this was a time in the Village in the 1910s where women were making all of these kinds of challenges to propriety and starting to claim a new kind of sexual freedom, maybe a right not to have children, to be their own people, to be individuals. And I think
sex not just as for procreation.
Right. And I think, Sanger, I think all of those ideas were appealing to Sanger. And then, as you mentioned, when she went, though, and worked in the tenements, and also when she assisted Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in the 1912 strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and she was actually charged with taking the strikers' children out of Lawrence and bringing some of them to New York because the strike became so violent. So I think just those experiences of seeing women's lives, and realizing how difficult they were, realizing how hard it was for women who didn't have birth control. She also talked about, seeing women having to work in factories or, perhaps work as domestic servants, basically right up until they gave birth, not being able to take time off after childbirth and having to go right back to work, right back to their domestic responsibilities. She, really realized, and this was also in connection with her own, kind of her own biographical experience, that for working class women, birth control was really an issue of, a real material question, I guess you would say, like a question not just of personal freedom, but also of kind of economics and what was possible, and sort of, trusting women to know what was going to be best for them and their families. So she starts off really being allied with the left, being allied with the Greenwich Village radicals, people like Emma Goldman, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And then during World War II, of course, there's a tremendous repression of the left. The left is basically discredited.
World War One.
World War One. I'm sorry. World War
II also.
Yeah, World War One. The left is really discredited, and then at that point, Sanger, I would say, she's looking for allies. She's looking for justifications. The thing she wants is still the same, which is to give, kind of make birth control legal, to give women access to it. But she ends up aligning herself with the eugenics movement. So she tries to appeal more to doctors and to kind of
get like the medical association
birth
to
control, and then she also appeals to the eugenics movement. And I think this is the thing that has really, tarnished her reputation, and there's been some interesting scholarly debates about, what was she thinking? Was she a racist? Was this just incidental? I would say, based on my knowledge of it, she was she was pragmatic. She might have hitched her cart to like anything that she thought would work, but unfortunately, eugenics is, very negative
It has some bad,
thing.
yes, bad consequences.
It has some bad, it has some bad ideas. It's some bad
Horrifying.
consequences.
Yeah.
Bad ideas with bad consequences. And it really came out of the 19th century. We can see it kind of coming out of Darwinism and ideas of evolution, and that people should start managing evolution. And there's an idea of first of positive eugenics, that the procreation of the fit, and the best types should be encouraged.
Well, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier too, like this fear that so that the fit,
Right.
According to the eugenicists, would be white women, right? But that they
Right.
weren't having enough children,
Right.
and all these other people are here now,
Right.
and what is this going to do for this country? And that these people, that there's some kind of genetic predisposition not to understand democracy, and that was going to be harmful to the country.
Absolutely. And so it really ends up tying into all of these ideas of racial hierarchy, not just black and white, but there was an idea that Jews were a separate race and Italians were a different race and Poles and Slavs. And I mean, it was broken down.
Well, and it's so specific too. And there's these categories of
Right.
Nordic, Mediterranean, and what was the other one in the middle? Alpine or something like that. Just these crazy kind of lists of the ways that people were grouped
Right.
in order to classify.
Right. The only thing that was consistent probably was that white Anglo-Saxon
Were on the
Protestants were always on top. But yes, there were all of these. So she started appealing to these ideas, and a lot of, eugenic ideas also supported immigration restriction. I mean, a lot of those ideas were invoked in terms of limiting immigration. And so Sanger said, well, birth control can also, this can be a means of promoting eugenics.
Well, I mean, I think she's such an important person to study, almost precisely because she is so complicated. And you certainly can't understand the birth control movement without her.
Definitely.
And I think this is a good example of how complicated history should be looked at from all of these angles. And we don't, it's important to learn this. It's important to think about it. It's important to realize the consequences of the actions that she took, even if she did them for pragmatic reasons.
Absolutely.
And yet there are a lot of men who have complicated histories that we still study. One, I know we need to close and we need to move to questions, but I wanted to make sure we got to a friend of or someone who worked with Margaret Sanger, which was Rose Pastor Stokes, who was someone who was born in Poland, comes also as a child, I think at 9 or 10, is working to help support the family. Her mother left just with her and then remarried in Cleveland, and then that husband left. And so Rose Pastor Stokes is working to help support the family. She's a writer, so she writes into a Yiddish newspaper here on the Lower East Side, and they're like, wow, you're a great writer, come to New York. So she comes to New York and then moves her family here into a tenement on Grand Street, I think. And she's writing for this newspaper. And then through this newspaper, she has to interview James Graham Phelps Stokes, a millionaire who's spending time now at the University Settlement House. They meet, they fall in love, and she gets married. And it's this kind of a romance story, but really her passion, her love is socialism. And then because of socialism, she is connected to birth control because she understands the class connection. And there's this speech that she gives in 1916, somewhere in here. I will find it, but I just thought there was something so relevant to today. First of all, she talks about sources. She talks about all the letters she's receiving from mothers. I've spent a good deal of my time answering letters, refusing no one. Letters from mothers with overlarge families and a small surplus of strength and hardly any income. Women whose several children have died at birth because of constitutional inability to bring children into the world able to survive. Letters from young mothers with 2 or 3 or 4 children who, because of sickness or temporary worklessness on the part of the wage earner, desire to wait for a time when they can decently and safely take care of more children by bringing more into the world. Letters from mothers who have been warned by their physicians that another childbirth would mean the mother's death, but to whom those same doctors denied contraceptive information. Letters from mothers already overburdened with large families who frankly confess that they have resorted from time to time in their desperation to abortion, begging for the knowledge that would make necessary a repetition of the horrors they have passed through. So this keeps going.
Right.
But and she makes this point that she's going to break this law. She's going to break the Comstock law willingly because it's unfair that other women have access through doctors to contraception that these working class women don't. So that kind of class issue kind of keeps keeps coming up. But there are elements of this speech. I feel like you could listen to it, and it relates to what we're reading about and experiencing today with such a need for all of this. And just curious if any thoughts at the end as we close out and we go to questions about Rose Pastor Stokes, about this idea of the way that class plays such an important role in access.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great source, and I think, to me, it sort of takes me back to the beginning, which is that women are going to seek birth control, they're going to seek abortion if it fails, and the question is, will it be safe? Will it be accessible? Will it be affordable? Or will it be dangerous, And so I think, to me, one of the really tragic things about what's happening with this Supreme Court decision is I feel like we already know the consequences of abortion being illegal.
The
Historically, they're terrible. And we can already see the ways in which this law is, kind of falling upon the most vulnerable people who don't really, who lack the, they lack the means, and how difficult it's going, just how it's going to be more difficult for some people than for others. I mean, that sounds like kind of a cliche, but I think just the class, the differentials in social class, and now on top of it, we're going to have this weird differential in terms of the state you live in. She's not even talking about that, but ironically, I think the same states that are curtailing abortion rights the most aggressively are the states that have, the least health care and the least social safety net. So there's just a huge irony to me in the whole, the whole endeavor.
Let's see if we have any questions we have a live audience here, and we also might have questions that are from the chat.
So to start us out, there was someone in the YouTube audience who was curious about Comstock's sort of influence, and wondering if you could talk a little bit more about whether religion and Christianity, and particularly conservative Christianity, was influencing the way that he was then trying to push Congress to make illegal birth control.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say that we can see with Comstock this desire to separate sex, seeing the separation of sex and procreation as being, kind of immoral and dangerous and something that needed to stop. But that's an idea that was also popular with the Catholic Church. There was sort of a consistent Catholic opposition to any sort of barriers to pregnancy. And then it became kind of an evangelical Christian point, in recent times. So there is a way in which some of these past attitudes are maybe not as past as some of us might like them to be.
Yeah, and I know that at Comstock there was some story about a friend of his going somewhere and having like lewd materials. I don't know exactly what it was, and then that led to the friend, I think, getting some kind of sexually transmitted disease and dying, and that was supposedly what kind of like motivated him. But I don't know. I mean, I'm not getting the details of it right. But there was something about that.
Thank you. And then we have another question on just the transition from midwives to doctors, and sort of over how many decades does that happen? The viewer was wondering sort of if that is happening quickly, and if so, why is that happening so quickly? But just a little bit more on that sort of evolution that we see.
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's basically that like 1900 to 1930 would be that time period that the doctors are coming more into prominence and starting to replace the midwife first with regard to kind of replacing the midwife by doing home visits and that. And then by the 1930s, I think moving more into the hospitals, I believe. I think, too, one interesting thing is that certain immigrant groups, and you were saying this earlier, too, and certain different groups responded differently to the idea of either going to a hospital or going to a doctor. So in this building, we had in the 19-teens and 1920s mostly Italian and Jewish residents, and what observers saw over time was that the Jewish women were more likely to go to that lying-in hospital, for example, or to request a doctor from that lying-in hospital, in part because they thought, oh, this was like a modern thing to do, that there was this like idea of like being modern that was important, that kind of led to that. And again, there were still many Jewish women who never went to the doctor and only went to the midwife, but there was slightly more kind of interest in that. And I think so there are different cultural things that affected the rates at which different groups of New Yorkers are going to move towards doctors and hospitals as opposed to midwives. But I think it's a period of decades, but really like because what happens is it starts to go down in New York City, and then with the arrival of more and more immigrants in the late 1890s, then you have the return of the midwife.
Right.
I also think some of it depended on just the generation of women. I think women who were themselves, had migrated and English was their second language, they were much more likely to seek a midwife, and perhaps their daughters, 20 years later, when they, for their own childbirth, might have been more likely
Exactly,
to
yeah. I think that's
seek
such a good point. Like what point you are in that, yeah.
Yeah, so sort of where you fell in that
generation.
Yeah.
Thank you. And our final question will come from our audience in the room tonight.
Excellent.
I'm wondering whether you know anything about where Margaret Sanger lived, because I know she was from a very poor family, and her mother had, I think, 16 or 17 pregnancies, died very young, and I think that was one of the motivations for her, was to help women to limit the number of pregnancies. But did she live somewhere in this area?
I think she grew up in upstate New York, right? And then came here, and I think when she was first married, lived in Westchester, that area, but didn't want to be out there. Like she was so enamored of the cosmopolitanism of the city, and moves to the city and lives in, I think, the Greenwich Village area, if I'm not mistaken. And I know, and her office was on West 16th Street, right off of Fifth Avenue. So there's a building, it's a beautiful brownstone that has a plaque on it, and that was not where she lived, but that was one of her offices. And then I think she lived on Fifth Avenue in an apartment building later on, and then earlier was in one of the numbered streets, but I don't remember which. So she wasn't that far from here, right? It was something that and I think that was so important for so many of these reformers and members of the progressive movement. They either moved into the Lower East Side, right, in settlement houses or in tenements, or they were coming here and spending a lot of their time here. So they were observing close hand. This wasn't something that was like a newspaper. This wasn't something that was, a television show or a podcast. They were, in many ways, like rolling up their sleeves and coming down. And I think for a lot, this would be the case both for women who would consider themselves reformers and more radical, but also a lot of middle class and upper class women, probably like the women that formed the hospital for the wet nurses, but came down here as parts of synagogues or churches to kind of do good and to kind of deliver charity and do what they can. So there was a real mixing, I think, that was happening on the streets of the Lower East Side that led to a lot of really interesting ideas. Are there any more? We have only scratched the surface of a topic that's very complex, for which we have not as many sources as we would want, and really kind of extends, not just in the tenement, but beyond the tenement. We're eager to hear your questions and ideas as we go forward to think about how we might continue this as a series and bring more people into the conversation as we continue to kind of learn more and study together. So. Lara, thank you so much. Your wisdom is so wonderful.
I mean, this was just a great conversation, and I think an opportunity to just start kind of processing historically some of the things that are happening in our current moment.
We invite you to come visit us again floor tours that you get to see the bedrooms firsthand. And for those of you who are virtual, we do virtual programs and we'll continue to do so. So thank you for those of you who are members and support us. And if you want to engage further, please follow us on social media, become a member of the Tenement Museum, and visit us. So thank you all so much. And thank you to all the good folks in this room that you don't see who helped set this amazing setup. So thank you, Gemma and Jacob and Chelsea and Kat, for all your amazing work behind the scenes. And thank you to our live in-person audience. And thank you to all of you out there. And see you soon at the Tenement Museum.